How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 18th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the 6th chapter of Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject, titled Metaphor and the Precipitation of Subjectivity. This section is much shorter than last and is split into two subchapters, the Signified and two faces of the Psychoanalytic subject, the latter of which has its own sub-subchapters. He continues from where we left off last time, this time examining separation, alienation, and traversing the fantasy through the lens of substitution, or rather, substitutional metaphors. To begin with alienation, in his words,
the other dominates or takes the place of the subject.
He schematizes this with this diagram. A similar operation occurs with separation, where objectia, acting as the other's desire, takes precedence over and subjugates the subject, shown with this. Finally, traversing the fantasy is carried out through the subject turning its cause, objectia, into itself, in his words, into
a kind of pure desiring without an object, desirousness.
This is shown with yet another diagram. These three processes are what Lacan refers to as substitutional metaphors. Put simply, they are the cancelling out of one thing by another. As a small aside, when Lacan and Fink talk about metaphors, they don't really mean it in the sense of a metaphor as is used day to day, but rather in the sense of the Russian linguist Roman Jakobson, who connected the term to what Ferdinand de Saussure calls associative relations, something we went over in our last series on Course in General Linguistics. It's the metaphorical axis of language that allows us to select terms and thus substitute them. Going back to the text now, Fink says that one of his principal theses is
that the psychoanalytic subject essentially has two faces, the subject as precipitate and the subject as breach.
The subject as precipitate is composed of meaning. In other words, it's what Lacan terms in his structuralist framework as a signified. The subject as breach, on the other hand, is rather something of a spark that flies from signifier to signifier, acting as a breach in the real. In the first case, which will be built on later on in the second subchapter, the subject is a sedimentation of meaning caused by the substitution and the retroactive workings of one signifier on another, something we looked at last episode. In the case of the second, the subject is the creative spark that defines metaphors, connecting different signifiers together. As such a spark, the subject has no permanence. It's a flash in the pan, essentially. However, as a result of the meaning produced by the metaphor, the subject in the first case, as precipitate, acquires persistence through being fixated or subjugated. This is the split subject as represented in the first two examples we gave of metaphors. Fink now says that the subject's relationship with symptoms has a metaphorical structure, that of a nonsensical signifier, S1, standing in for the barred subject, represented with this. In this sense, analysis is essentially focused on the creation of new metaphors to alter the position of the analyzer and subjectivity. However, in Fink's words,
given that the symptom itself is a metaphor, the creation of a new metaphor in the course of analysis brings about not the dissolution of all symptoms, but rather the reconfiguration of the symptom.
In the Lacanian framework, the end of analysis is then the third metaphor we looked at earlier, the subject taking the place of the other and the other's desire, no longer being subjugated. This takes us now to the first section of the chapter, the Signified. He begins with a quote from Sigmund Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis that sets the tone for the subchapter.
You must not rack your brain to try and understand this by seeking to compare it with something similar that is already familiar to you. You must recognize in it a fundamentally new fact.
What Fink is examining in this section is what exactly meaning is to Lacan. It goes all the way back to the distinction between signifier and signified put forth by Ferdinand de Saussure in his Course in General Linguistics, where signifiers refer to the sound images that make up language, and signifieds refer to the meaning that make up signs with those signifiers. Lacan takes a slightly different approach to Saussure, though. Instead of seeing signifieds and signifiers as equal components of signs, signifiers in Lacan's framework are given primacy. As Fink says,
what are thoughts, signifieds, but specific combinations of signifiers? That is, signifiers strung together in a particular way.
This returns to the idea that to understand means to locate one configuration of signifiers within another, essentially to situate a statement, thought, or term in the context of other statements, thoughts, or terms. In Lacan's framework, something only makes sense when it is placed into a pre-existing signifying chain, adding to that chain without fundamentally rocking the boat. However, metaphor changes all that. It's a shakedown of the old order. It establishes a new configuration of thoughts or of signifiers, establishing a new combination. In Fink's eyes, such an operation can't help but implicate the subject. This takes us to the next subchapter, two faces of the psychoanalytic subject. He starts out by stating that the two faces of the Lacanian subject are similar in a way to the split we looked at in the fourth episode of the series. However, unlike there, where the split corresponded to a division between unconscious meaning and to the false being of the ego, the latter term, the ego, is replaced by what Lacan terms the subject in the real. We now arrive at the first subchapter of the section, titled The Subject as Signified. Here, Fink begins by stating what the subject in the real is not.
It is not the person talked about by the analysand as limited in his or her abilities, subjected to the whims of the other, at the mercy of his or her friends, lovers, institutional setting, and so on.
What this is rather the castrated subject. What Fink means by castration here is an incredibly broad topic, which we'll examine more in depth later on in another episode. But to summarize, he's referring to the subject's alienation by and in the other, and its separation from it. Simply put, the castrated subject is the subject who has come to be in language. It exists as submitted to the other, not yet having traversed the fantasy and separating fully from the other. In Fink's words, it is characterized by having undergone the first two metaphors we looked at the beginning of this episode, but not the third. Summarizing how this relates to symptoms, Fink says,
Symptoms can be understood as messages about the subject that are designed for the other, and until the subject can separate from that locus or destination, he or she remains castrated.
In this way, there is no real connection between biological castration and what the term refers to in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Turning now to the role of being in castration, Fink states that the latter allows a sort of being through fantasy. However, Lacan sees this form of being as necessarily lacking, just like the being produced by the ego. In his eyes, neither one can take the subject beyond neurosis, since they both keep the subject submitted to the other, still keep it castrated. Ending this subchapter and leading on to the next, Fink says that the castrated subject is that which is represented. It always presents itself to the other, always looking to win attention and recognition from it. And, in his words,
the more it presents itself, the more inescapably castrated it becomes, as it is represented by and in the other.
This is the bard's subject. However, to understand the specifics of why it is so, we need to first take a step back and learn more about just how meaning is produced by the effect of one signifier on another, something he aims to begin to do with the next subchapter of signifiers, unary and binary. Fink begins the section by stating that this idea of a subject inaugurated by castration is closely connected to Freud's notion of primal repression. In Freud's view, the unconscious contains what are usually termed in English as ideational representatives, the psychical representations of sexual and death drives, something I have a short on that I'll link in the description below. The unconscious is constituted in his eyes by repression of these ideational representatives, stopping them from entering into consciousness. This process produces the nuclei of the unconscious, onto which other representatives attach themselves. Lacan calls for these ideational representatives to be equated with signifiers, the words that stand in for drives on the ideational level, the level of thought. By equating the two notions, Lacan posits that the unconscious is constructed on the basis of paired signifiers, S1, the unary signifier, and S2, the binary signifier, the latter being what is repressed in primal repression. This takes us to the next subsection, the signifier to which all other signifiers represent a subject. The binary subject, or binary signifier rather, that is primarily repressed, is the signifier of the other's desire, the name of the father. It's a unique signifier, that should the signifier go missing, none of the other signifiers once attached to it mean anything. As we saw in the last video, Lacan posited that there is a kind of primordial signifier that is either there or isn't. The name of the father is this primordial signifier, our Rock of Gibraltar, as Fink refers to it as. If other signifiers disappear, nothing much happens. Other signifiers just pick up the slack, see the replacement of certain terms by broader ones. However, the same operation can't occur with the name of the father, since it is neither pronounceable nor fungible. It cannot be replaced. When it is present, all's well and good. The subject is subjugated by language, sure, but at least there is a subject. This doesn't occur when it isn't there. Instead, psychosis results. To borrow from Fink,
the signifier is not able to neutralize the child's jouissance, and that jouissance erupts into his or her life, overwhelming and invading him or her.
If you haven't seen the last video, jouissance is essentially an extreme form of pleasure or excitement that includes pain. In psychosis, jouissance impacts the analysand in different ways. In the case of schizophrenia, it invades the body, whilst in paranoia, it invades the locus or place of the other. To summarize, the name of the father doesn't hold its own in psychosis. It is foreclosed, treated as if it didn't exist, or rather as if it had never existed at all. This happens because the barrier, the name, between the child and the figure that takes up the role of mother is not erected in a solid enough fashion. The child is unable to separate itself. Fink now turns to the choice of a name as relates to neurosis. Here, he gets into the aspect of it that is referenced in the title of the sub-subchapter, namely, that for the name of a father, all signifiers represent a subject, as he shows with this diagram. Every signifier used by the neurotic individual is somehow linked with the name. Thus, as Fink says,
the neurotic is implicated to a greater or lesser degree in every word he or she pronounces or hears.
Further, he states that nothing is innocent. Even so-called empty speech, stereotyped words that don't mean anything, implies a position of the subject in relation to the other, every single term having been involved in making that relation what it is. Fink now turns to S1 and S2, which he previously defined as unary and binary signifiers respectively. In the 1960s and 70s, Lacan had something of a change of mind regarding his algebraic system. S1 became synonymous not with a unary signifier, but with a so-called master signifier, a nonsensical signifier devoid of any meaning by itself, but which is brought into language through its relationship with various S2s, which, outside their connection with that master signifier, exist unbound. The name of the father is one such S1, and thus its absence reveals one of the most striking differences between the neurotic and psychotic position, the relationship the two have with language. A psychotic might be able to string together collections of S2s, but without an organizing S1, they exist as, in a way, independent from them. In Fink's words,
whereas a neurotic may, upon hearing an unusual term, say anti-disestablishmentarianism, be reminded of the first time he heard the word, who it was he learned it from, and so on.
The same isn't true for the psychotic, who might focus solely on its phonetic components, finding meaning in nothing or personal meaning in virtually everything, whereas being taken as actual, real objects. To give an example from non-Lacanian psychiatry, just think of one of the most common symptoms of psychosis, disorganized speech or formal thought disorder. People afflicted with the symptom may respond to questions based on the sound of words, unable to make the same connections that neurotics can. Returning back to the text now, Fink states that for the neurotic, each S2 links back individually to S1. However, neither of these constitute the subject itself. To borrow a turn of phrase from Lacan,
the subject is that which one signifier represents to or for another.
The question this raises is what exactly representation is. Using this diagram, Fink says that S2 represents the subject, insofar as it retroactively gives meaning to S1, a meaning that didn't originally exist at the outset. Using a fuller diagram of this process, we can see that this meaning is one and the same with the barred subject. In particular, with the subject as precipitate. This subject is nothing more than a constellation of meaning. In other words, the whole set of meanings generated by the relationship between S1 and S2, a process allowed by the other, the realm of signifiers and language. Fink ends the entire section by returning to his diagram of Lacan's inversion of Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum. I think where I am not, therefore I am where I do not think. What this inversion is referring to is the split between unconscious meaning, thinking, and conscious being. The subject as meaning can be situated in the lower right-hand corner, but because of their mutual exclusiveness, is deprived of being. This takes us to the last section of the chapter, titled The Subject as Breach. He begins by addressing the fact that the subject is more than simply a sedimentation of meaning, represented under the bar in this diagram. Additionally, he says, the subject is the forging of links between signifiers. This comes back to Freud's work on the neuron that he did in his neurology days, where he referred to the paths forged between neurons as what Lacan translates as frayage. This frayage entails a breaching of sorts, a path breaking. In Fink's words,
he takes Freud's idea to be that of a breaking through that establishes a link between so-called conceptual memories and readily associates these neuronal links with signifiers.
The subject from the point of view of frayage is the path that links signifiers together. At this point in Lacan's thought, around the time of his seminar 17, S1 had changed in meaning somewhat. No longer was there just one master signifier, the name of a father, but rather a multitude. An S1 at this point in time referred simply to any signifier isolated from the rest of discourse, something that closes off associations rather than opens them up. The signifier is unique to each analysand, its meaning being opaque to them. As an example, take the word death as a master signifier for a specific patient. This analysand might understand the death on a conceptual level, understand what it means in their mother tongue, but it remains opaque insofar as they are incapable of truly appreciating what it means to them specifically. It's in this way that Lacan describes S1s as meaningless or nonsensical. This brings us to the first and only sub-subchapter of the section, the Precipitation of Subjectivity, dialectizing a master signifier. Here, his concern is with the concept of dialectization, defined by Lacan as the bringing in of an outside signifier, an S2, to establish a relationship with a master signifier. The outcome of this process is that the S1 no longer acts as a blocking point, stopping associations from forming. To borrow from the text,
a bridge is built between it and another linguistic element, and a loss takes place.
He represents this operation with this diagram. The loss he's talking about is represented by the little a below the S2, something we'll look into in more detail in the next couple episodes. However, for now, his only concern is with the first part of the operation. As he states,
the analysand is no longer stuck at that particular point of his or her associations. After running up against the same term off and on for what may have been months on end, it begins to give.
This is possible because dialectization gives meaning to S1, dissolving its nonsense. Through the process, the subject is once again split between meaning and being, momentarily having to come to be forging a bond between the two signifiers, represented by this diagram. Fink says now that we have to be careful to differentiate between the subject which has come into being, the S above the arrow, and the barred or alienated subject of meaning, represented with the barred S, although he doesn't expand on this point. He ends the section by listing the 4 tasks he has described psychoanalysis as seeking to complete, namely the dialectization of master signifiers, the precipitation of subjectivity, the creation of a new metaphor, and the subjectification of the cause. However, he says, all of these things are actually one and the same.
When a metaphor is dialectized, metaphorization occurs. The subject is precipitated, and the subject assumes a new position in relation to the cause.
In other words, they all come under the umbrella of separation and further separation, more accurately described as traversing the fantasy. Here, one of Lacan's breaks with Freud is discovered. Unlike the latter, who saw analysis as inevitably limited by what he termed the rock of castration, Lacan suggests that separation allows the subject to get past that roadblock. By subjectifying one's cause, the other's desire, one can essentially overcome alienation. Now, this concludes the chapter on metaphor, the precipitation of subjectivity, from Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject. I know this was quite a dense video like last time, but I truly hope you enjoyed or at least learned something. If you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at Chapter 7, Object A, Cause of Desire. Until then, bye.